Iran moved first. Fast Iranian boats surged into the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point. Nearly one-fifth of the world's oil moves through this water. And on that morning, those boats cut sharply across the path of a U.S. presence moving through the shipping lane. Speed, proximity, aggressive maneuvering in a place where a single mistake can shut down a global choke point. For a brief moment, it looked like Iran had forced the United States into a dangerous decision. But that was only true on the surface. Because while the pressure was visible, the real shift in control may have already begun somewhere else. Iran moved first. Fast Iranian craft cut across the narrow Gulf waters, their wakes slicing sharp white lines through the morning sea. They accelerated hard, angling toward a U.S. presence, moving steadily through the corridor. On the surface, it looked like a simple maneuver. Small boats, high speed, aggressive geometry, and a tight stretch of water. But the location made it dangerous. Only a short distance away, commercial vessels were threading through one of the world's busiest shipping routes. Oil tankers, cargo carriers, slow-moving hulls that could not easily turn away. In waters like this, distance disappears quickly, and every maneuver matters. The Iranian boats pushed closer. Their formation tightened, crossing the path of the American transit with deliberate angles. It was the kind of move designed to test reactions. Approach fast, change direction, force the other side to decide immediately. From a distance, it looked like pressure. Inside the American command chain, something else was already shaping the encounter, because this was not an empty patch of sea. The waters below were only one layer of the battlefield. Above it, the United States maintained a watchful network of aircraft sensors and command links. An invisible envelope of awareness stretched over the shipping lanes. From that vantage point, the movement of every fast craft was easier to follow. Every turn, every acceleration, every crossing angle against the water. But on the surface, none of that was visible. What the Iranian crews saw instead was a calm American posture. No sudden maneuver, no aggressive turn, no visible reaction that suggested urgency. The U.S. presence held its course through the narrow corridor as the Iranian boats tightened their pattern around it. Closer now, the distance between vessels shrinking with every pass. To outside observers, the moment carried a clear message. Iran was pushing forward, and the United States, at least for now, was holding back. In confrontations like this, appearances can shape the entire encounter. Aggression creates pressure. Pressure forces decisions, and decisions made too quickly can change the balance of control. The Iranian boats surged again, their wakes spreading wide as they crossed ahead of the American path. It was a direct test, a signal that the encounter was no longer routine navigation. Something had begun here. But what that something meant was still unclear. Had Iran just seized the initiative in these waters, or had the challenge already pushed the encounter into a battlefield the Iranians could not fully see? The Iranian boats accelerated again. Their engines roared as they cut sharply across the waterway, throwing wide wakes behind them. One boat surged ahead of the American track. Another curved in from the side, tightening the angle. Speed, proximity, movement designed to feel unpredictable. This was not random harassment. It was a method. Iran's small craft doctrine had always relied on one advantage. They could move faster than larger ships could react, and in narrow water, speed becomes pressure. The boats closed distance, quickly slipping across the American path in tight arcs, then pulling away, then returning again. Each pass forced the same silent question. Would the United States react or keep holding its course? Because in encounters like this, control often belongs to the side that forces the first visible decision. Iranian crews understood that. If the Americans turned sharply, they could claim intimidation had worked. If the Americans escalated, the encounter would suddenly become public. Either way, the pressure would shift the tempo, and tempo in close confrontations can become power. The boats pressed harder. Their formation spread wider, now cutting across the corridor from different directions. One crossed ahead. Another swung in behind. A third accelerated along the edge of the formation, forcing the distance tighter. On radar screens and open water alike, the geometry was obvious. The Americans were being boxed into a decision cycle, and every second that passed made the pressure more visible. The U.S. presence still did not react. No sharp maneuver, no aggressive interception, just a steady course through the corridor. From the outside, that restraint looked dangerous. A warship surrounded by smaller, faster boats in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. If the Americans waited too long, the encounter could spiral. If they reacted too quickly, they might escalate something the world was watching. That was the gamble. And on the surface, Iran seemed to understand the moment better. The boats surged closer again. Their wakes crossed each other in tight patterns, white trails crisscrossing the water behind them. Every movement carried a message. We control the space. We control the tempo. We decide what happens next. But the real contest was not happening only on the water. Far above the boats and shipping lanes, another layer of the battlefield was quietly active. From the sky, the entire encounter looked different. Patterns were easier to follow, angles clearer, speed changes easier to track. The Iranian boats believed they were forcing reactions below. What they did not see was how clearly their movement could now be measured. Every turn added another line to the picture. Every pass revealed another pattern, and the longer the pressure continued, the clearer that picture became. But none of that was visible from the water. To the Iranian crews, the encounter still looked exactly the way they wanted it to look. American restraint, Iranian momentum, a challenge unfolding in plain sight. And that illusion was the most important part of the entire maneuver. Because if the United States was truly being forced into reacting publicly, then Iran had already achieved something valuable. The move worked for one reason. It forced the United States to react in public. Or at least, that was what it looked like. But somewhere above the water, the encounter was already being watched from a very different angle, and that view was beginning to change everything. The Iranian boats turned again. One cut sharply across the corridor, its wake curling wide behind the hull. Another accelerated along the outer edge, then angled inward toward the American path. Fast, sharp, confident. From the surface, the pattern looked aggressive, but after several passes, something subtle began to appear. The angles were repeating. The speeds were similar. The approach vectors were not random. They were structured. The same arcs across the water, the same tightening distances, the same maneuver windows opening and closing again. Pressure, yes, but pressure with a pattern. And patterns, once visible, begin to change the nature of a confrontation. Inside the American command network, the encounter was no longer just movement on water. Each Iranian turn became a data point. Each acceleration added another layer of clarity. Tracking systems followed the craft continuously. Speed, heading, separation, behavior over time. From that perspective, the boats were not chaotic. They were predictable. And predictability is the enemy of surprise. Above the water, the encounter unfolded inside a larger field of awareness. Aircraft moving high over the Gulf. Observation systems linking movement across the corridor. Command teams watching the geometry develop in real time. From that vantage point, the Iranian maneuver was easier to read than the crews below realized. Every aggressive pass revealed intent. Every close crossing confirmed behavior. What had looked like intimidation was becoming classification. Intent was no longer guesswork. It was forming into a recognizable pattern, and that realization changed the meaning of American restraint. Because the U.S. presence below had still not reacted aggressively, the course remained steady. Speed unchanged. No sudden maneuver breaking the geometry of the encounter. To observers outside the command loop, that restraint could still look dangerous. A larger vessel allowing smaller, faster craft to close distance repeatedly. But inside the decision chain, the calculation was different. Reaction too early would end the picture. Reaction too late could create unnecessary risk. So the Americans waited. Not passively, deliberately. Allowing the pattern to continue just long enough for ambiguity to disappear. The Iranian boats pressed again. One surged forward, its bow cutting hard across the American track. Another followed seconds later, tightening the maneuver even further. Closer now. The wakes from both craft overlapping across the corridor. On the surface, it still looked like momentum. Iranian speed, Iranian initiative. But something important had already shifted. The Americans were no longer watching for possibilities. They were watching confirmations. Each pass narrowed uncertainty. Each maneuver clarified behavior. The encounter was becoming readable. And once a battlefield becomes readable, the side that understands it first begins to control it. The Iranian crews could not see that change. From their perspective, the encounter still belonged to them. They were the ones accelerating. They were the ones forcing the geometry. They were the ones dictating distance. The Americans still appeared calm, still restrained, still unwilling to react. But that calm was no longer uncertainty. It was confirmation. The pattern had revealed enough. Not everything, but enough. And in confrontations like this, the difference between uncertainty and confirmation is enormous. Because the moment intent becomes clear, a different set of decisions becomes available. The Iranian boats surged once more, tightening their maneuver around the American presence. Their wakes crossed again across the narrow waterway. To them, the pressure was still building, but from above, the picture was now almost complete. What Iran thought was pressure was quietly becoming a map, and maps have a dangerous property in conflict. Once they are complete, the next move stops being guesswork. It becomes timing. The Americans were almost there, almost ready to act. But one thing still had to happen. The line had to be crossed. One Iranian boat pushed too far. Its bow cut hard across the corridor closer than any of the earlier passes. Another followed from the flank, compressing the space around the American transit. This time the pattern changed, not in speed, not in aggression, in certainty. The earlier passes had built pressure. This one removed doubt. What had been measured as possibility now hardened into confirmed behavior. The geometry was no longer ambiguous. The crossing angle, the timing, the coordinated follow-on movement. Together they did something simple and dangerous. They crossed the line. From that moment on, the encounter was no longer being interpreted, it was being acted upon. Inside the American response chain, the shift was immediate. Not loud, not theatrical. Immediate. Warning sharpened, posture changed. The calm surface of restraint gave way to a different kind of control. This was the part Iran had misread. American patience had never meant uncertainty. It had meant the opposite. The United States had waited until the encounter was clear enough to define. And once it was defined, the available response became far more precise. The ship below held steady only long enough for the picture to fully resolve. Now the response activated in sequence, not rushed, not improvised, prepared. The Iranian crews could feel that change at once, because pressure only works while the other side is still forced to guess. The moment guessing ends, pressure begins losing its power. That was what happened here. The boats surged in, expecting hesitation. What they met instead was a battle space that had already closed around them. The Americans were no longer reacting to movement. They were reacting to intent. And intent, once classified, changes everything. The same narrow water that had helped the Iranian craft now began to work against them. Their maneuver room tightened. Their options shrank. Every aggressive angle that had once created tempo now exposed them more clearly. Every second they stayed inside the pattern made the situation less flexible, not more. One boat pulled slightly outward. Another hesitated just long enough to show that the initiative had already shifted. That hesitation mattered, because initiative is not just who moves first, it is who can still shape the next move. And Iran was beginning to lose that ability. The challenge that had looked sharp and aggressive stopped generating leverage. It generated constraint. The Americans had not needed spectacle to reverse the encounter. They had needed clarity. Once the threshold was crossed, clarity became control, and control changed the meaning of every movement after that. What had looked minutes earlier like an Iranian attempt to force a public reaction was now an Iranian struggle to avoid stepping deeper into a response already prepared. The boats were still moving, the wakes were still cutting the water, but the encounter no longer belonged to them. The line had been crossed, the response had begun. And the tactical freedom Iran thought it possessed was collapsing in real time. That was the real reversal, not a blast, not a dramatic strike, a transfer of control so clean that it only became obvious after it had already happened. The moment the line was crossed, the encounter stopped belonging to Iran. And once that happened, the pressure itself began working in reverse. Now the question was no longer whether Iran could force the United States to react. It was how much room Iran had left before its own challenge became a trap. The Iranian boats were still moving. Their engines roared across the narrow waterway, wakes spreading wide behind them as they turned again. But something fundamental had changed. Only minutes earlier, those movements had created pressure. Now they created exposure. The same speed, the same angles, the same aggressive passes across the corridor. Yet the geometry no longer produced leverage. It produced limits. One craft pulled slightly outward, widening the distance it had been tightening moments before. Another slowed just enough to avoid cutting too sharply across the American track again. That hesitation was subtle, but in confrontations like this, subtle shifts reveal everything. Initiative had moved, and once initiative moves, the entire structure of an encounter changes with it, because pressure only works while the other side is uncertain. When uncertainty disappears, pressure begins to collapse. That was happening now. The maneuver pattern that had once forced decisions was no longer forcing anything. It was constraining the side that created it. Every aggressive pass the Iranian boats had made had helped clarify the encounter. Every crossing wake, every tightening arc across the corridor, every attempt to dictate the tempo. Together they had revealed intent faster than they had forced reaction, and that was the mistake. The Americans had not needed to overpower the maneuver, they had simply needed to understand it. Once the pattern became clear, the balance of control shifted quietly but completely. The narrow waterway that had seemed useful to Iran now limited its room to maneuver. The pressure geometry collapsed under its own weight, where the boats could move, where they could turn, caught with search at how close they could safely pass. Every option narrowed. And the longer the encounter continued, the more that narrowing became obvious. Iran had not lost because its boats were slow. They were fast. They were aggressive. They were tactically confident. But confidence alone cannot control a battlefield that someone else already understands. The real contest had not been about speed, or proximity, or intimidation. It had been about clarity. The side that sees the picture first decides when the encounter truly begins, and when it ends. Iran challenged the United States in open water. On the surface, the challenge looked bold. Small craft pressing against a larger presence. Aggression forcing attention. Momentum forcing decisions. But that image was incomplete. Because the real battle had never been limited to the boats cutting across the water. It had been unfolding inside a wider field of awareness. A battlefield where movement could be measured. Patterns recognized. Intent classified. By the time the Iranian boats believed they had forced the United States into reacting, the encounter had already shifted. Control had already changed hands, and the pressure that once drove the confrontation was already beginning to work in reverse. Iran challenged the U.S. Air Force, but the real battle had been decided long before the challenge was visible. At the beginning, it looked simple. Iran moved first. Fast boats cutting across narrow Gulf water, forcing distance to shrink, forcing the moment to look dangerous. On the surface, it felt like pressure, but that pressure was only real while the battlefield remained unclear. By the time the Iranian boats believed they had forced the United States into reacting, the encounter had already changed. The pattern had been seen, the line had been crossed, and control had quietly shifted. What looked like aggression had revealed intent. What looked like hesitation had been confirmation. In confrontations like this, the side that moves first does not decide the outcome. The side that understands the battlefield does. And in the end, the Gulf water looked exactly the same as it had before. The boats still turning, the corridor still open. But the encounter that once looked contested had already been decided somewhere above the water.